A hoe. I walked 2 hours for a hoe. Emmerich didn't look up from the anvil. It's a good hoe. My grandfather made better hoes, and he's been dead 9 years. The farmer dropped 3 coppers on the workbench, short, and they both knew it, and hauled the tool over his shoulder like it personally owed him something. Word in Falomir is you tried forging a sword once. Bent it in the quench. That true? It's true. Shame. Man your age, still just mattocks and hinges. The farmer left without waiting for anything back. Emmerich picked up his hammer and spun it once through his fingers, a full, slow turn, the way he did when there was nothing left to hit, and his hands needed something to do anyway. He set it down, picked it back up, turned it again, 24 years old, and every blade he'd ever tried to make had come out of the fire wrong, brittle, warped, or simply refusing to hold an edge no matter how carefully he worked the steel. His father used to say the same thing about him that the farmer just had, though his father had said it kinder. Some men are built for the plow, son. Nothing shameful in that. His father had said a lot of things, right up until the morning he stopped being able to say anything at all. The memory didn't arrive gently. It never did. 1 second Emmerich was banking the forge for the night, and the next, he was 7 years old again, watching smoke climb out of his own house in a straight black line against a clean morning sky. His mother's hand had been in his. Then it wasn't. A man in white and ash robes had said the word heretic the way other men said good morning. Casual, practiced, already moving on to the next house on the list, and Emmerich had been dragged behind a rain barrel by a neighbor's wife before he understood what any of it meant. He remembered the knight's face for exactly as long as it took the memory to pass. Young then. Calm. Utterly, professionally calm, the way a butcher is calm. Rennick. Emmerich banked the forge. His hands were steady doing it, which was its own kind of lie. He didn't sleep that night so much as lie still with his eyes shut. Sometime past midnight, he gave up entirely, pulled on his boots, and walked the half-mile out to the old battlefield ridge above Falomir, a stretch of churned earth where, 40 years back, 2 lords had spent an afternoon killing each other's men over a boundary line nobody remembered anymore. Bones worked their way up through the soil out there every spring. Good scrap iron sometimes, still buckled to what was left of the dead. He needed the metal. That was the whole of it. That was all he told himself. He found a skeleton half-surfaced near a fallen banner pole, arm bones scattered, ribs mostly intact, a rusted breastplate still strapped across what used to be a chest. He knelt, worked the plate loose, and one of the ribs cracked under his knee with a sound too much like a green branch snapping. He hit it with the hammer. Not thinking. Just frustration finding somewhere to go, the way it always did. One hard strike against the loose ribs to break them apart for easier carrying. The hammer didn't bounce off bone the way it should have. It sank in, half an inch, like the bone had gone soft as green wood, and something came up through the haft into his palm that wasn't heat and wasn't cold. A third thing with no name he owned yet, that ran up his arm and into his chest and settled there like a hook finding purchase. The skeleton's ribs stopped being ribs. Emmerich watched them knit themselves back together in the moonlight, faster than any healing he'd ever seen a priest work. Bone drawing in around the hammer's strike, the way hot metal draws in around a mold. He pulled back on instinct. The hammer came with him, and the skeleton's arm came up off the ground on its own, fingers curling into the dirt. He should have run. He understood that clearly, later, looking back on it. In the moment, he stayed exactly where he was, hammer raised, breath gone, watching a dead man's hand test its own grip on the earth for the first time in 40 years. The skull turned toward him, no eyes in it, it didn't need any. Something in Emmerich's chest went cold and hollow all at once. Not pain, nothing so simple as pain, more like a cup being poured out fast. And for 4 seconds, the world lost its color entirely, gray battlefield under a gray moon, before the color came back and left him on his knees in the dirt, gasping like he'd been the one dragged up out of the ground. The skeleton knelt too, not out of any command he'd given, just knelt, the way a soldier kneels before an officer, muscle memory 40 years dead and still perfectly intact in the bone. Emmerich looked at his own hand. Thin lines had come up under the skin along his wrist, faint blue-green, like ink bleeding through wet paper. They faded as he watched. Not gone, just waiting. He looked at the thing kneeling in front of him, patient, silent, missing half an arm, entirely his. Right. he said, and his voice came out smaller than he meant it to. Right. Let's not do that again tonight. The skeleton didn't answer. It didn't need eyes to watch him either, and it didn't stop watching as he backed away one slow step at a time, hammer still in his hand, the taste of old copper sitting heavy on the back of his tongue the whole walk home. The hammer glowed now, faint, blue-green, threading along the steel like veins under skin, visible only in the dark, which was, Emmerich had decided, the only time he could risk any of this. He fed the small fire another stick and held the hammerhead over it until the lines brightened from faint to unmistakable. Third night in a row on the ridge. He'd told his neighbor he was hunting rabbits. Nobody in Fallowmere had ever known him to hunt anything in his life, but nobody had asked twice either. That was the one mercy of being the village's least impressive man. Nobody watched him closely enough to catch a lie. The first body he tried that night was fresh. A traveler, robbed and killed on the North Road 2 weeks back, buried shallow by whoever hadn't wanted the trouble of a deeper grave, still mostly flesh. Still recognizably a man, he struck it once, hammer humming with heat and that other thing underneath the heat. It rose slow, wrong. One arm dragged, the shoulder never quite finding where it should sit, the whole thing lurching upright like a puppet with half its strings cut. It took 3 tries just to stand without falling. Emmerich watched it sway and felt something close to disappointment, which surprised him more than the corpse did. He put it back down with a second strike and moved on. The second attempt was 30 yards off, half-surfaced bone with no flesh left on it at all. Older, cleaner, whoever it had been reduced entirely to structure. He struck it once. It came up in under 2 seconds. No stagger, no wrong angle. It stood the way a man stands who's stood at attention 1,000 times before, weight settled, spine straight, and when Emmerich took a step back out of pure reflex, the skeleton's head turned to track the movement with an economy that had nothing shambling in it at all. He understood, watching it, something he hadn't let himself think through properly until that exact moment. Flesh fought him. Flesh remembered dying, remembered rot, remembered the wrongness of what he was doing to it, and it resisted with every rotted fiber. Bone didn't fight. Bone had already let go of all of that. What was left in it, steadiness, discipline, whatever a body had actually been good at while it was alive, sat there clean and waiting, the way a tool waits on a rack for a hand that knows how to use it. The fresh dead were weaker, the old dead were stronger. And somewhere underneath both of those facts sat a third one he didn't have proof of yet. Only a guess, sharp enough to chase. He found the proof 4 nights later, on the far side of the ridge, where the ground dipped low enough to have stayed wet through every spring for 40 years straight. One grave marker, not stone, a sword blade broken off 2 inches from the hilt, driven point first into the earth so long ago the metal had gone to lace with rust. No name, no date. Whoever buried this man hadn't wanted him remembered or hadn't had time to manage it before the fighting moved on. Emmerich dug with his hands until his knuckles split, heated the hammer, and struck the skull once. The skeleton was on its feet before the sound of the strike finished ringing. Not upright. Ready. Knees bent, weight forward, one arm already swinging out in the shape of a guard for a blade that had rotted away a lifetime ago. The whole body moving through a stance so clean it looked rehearsed 1,000 times that same week rather than 4 decades dead. It read Emmerich's flinch before Emmerich finished flinching, adjusted its weight to it, and only then, finding no actual threat behind the motion, settled. Emmerich sat back hard in the mud. "Right," he said when his voice came back. "You were somebody." The skeleton didn't answer. It never would, but it turned its skull toward him with an attention that felt considered rather than empty, and something about the stillness of that attention made the silence feel less like absence and more like a man choosing not to speak. "You're not much for talking," Emmerich said. "Fine. Garrick, then." He had no reason for the name beyond the fact that it fit the mouth the way a good hammer fits a hand, and Garrick, if the name meant anything at all to whatever was left in the bone, gave no sign either way. The wolf came out of the tree line an hour later, drawn by blood scent still hanging over the freshly turned grave. Emmerich heard the brush move before he saw it, and by the time his own body had finished deciding to be afraid, Garrick was already between them. No order given, no thought spared to give one. The skeleton had simply moved. stepped sideways into the exact line a lunging animal would need to cross to reach the man behind it. Arms up, though it held no weapon, weight low, though it had no muscle left to brace with. A stance built entirely out of a memory. The mind that once carried it had never survived to keep. The wolf read the shape of that stance well enough to change its mind. It circled once, found nothing worth the risk, and vanished back into the dark the way it had come. Emmerich let his breath out slow. His hand, when he reached to steady himself on the ground, found bone instead of dirt. Garrick had turned, wordless, and offered an arm down to help him up. Cold fingers closed loose around his wrist. Careful. Like something that remembered even now exactly how much pressure a living hand could stand to take. Emmerich let himself be pulled up. It was, he realized, the first hand that had reached back for him in longer than he cared to count. The cartwheel had thrown a shoe outside the mill, and by the time Emmerich got there, half of Fallowmere had already gathered to watch a stranger try to talk a lame horse into standing still. "You're the smith," she said, before he'd said anything at all. Not a question. She'd already asked someone, already had the answer filed away before she needed it. "I make hose," Emmerich said, "and hinges. Mostly hinges. You'll do." She held the horse's bridle steady with one hand, the other braced flat against its shoulder in a way that suggested she'd done this before and hated it exactly as much every time. "I can pay in silver or in a letter of passage stamped by the diocese at Kale's Reach, whichever's more useful where you're standing." Nobody in Fallowmere used the word diocese casually. A few of the onlookers found somewhere else to be. Emmerich looked at her properly for the first time. Cloak too fine for the road dust on it, boots too new for the miles they'd clearly walked, and eyes that had already finished counting the mill's 2 doors, the smithy's 1, and every person standing near enough to matter before she'd said a single unnecessary word. "Silver's fine," he said. She introduced herself over the anvil 20 minutes later while he worked the new shoe into shape, and she watched his hands the way some people watch a card game they suspect is rigged. Wren Calder. "I'm cataloging parish records for the Kale's Reach chapter house, birth registers, burial grounds, that sort of thing. Villages this far from a proper church tend to lose track of their own dead. The diocese likes its ledgers tidy. Long way to come for ledgers. You'd be surprised what the diocese considers worth the ride." She said it lightly. Her eyes didn't match the lightness at all. "Your burial grounds on the old ridge east of the village, I'm told. I'll want to walk it, compare what's recorded against what's actually out there." Emmerich's hammer didn't slow. He was proud of that later, thinking back on it. The one lie his hands had ever told convincingly in his life, delivered by simply not stopping. "Not much to see," he said. "Old battlefield, bones and mud. Then it shouldn't take long." She left the smithy with her repaired horse and a promise to return within the week, and Emmerich stood alone at the anvil for a long moment afterward, turning the hammer slowly through his fingers, not from stress this time. From plain, ordinary fear, he'd just watched someone competent walk directly toward the one place in the world he could least afford anyone competent walking toward. He went to the ridge that same night anyway. Some habits didn't care what the day had already cost him. Garrick was waiting where he always waited, seated against the broken sword marker, like a soldier at ease between watches, and rose without being asked the moment Emmerich's boots found the top of the rise. "We've got a problem," Emmerich told him, which was foolish. Garrick had no ears worth the name, no mouth to answer with. But 4 nights of talking to the dead had taught Emmerich that the habit didn't require an audience so much as it required speaking. The way the hammer spin required motion rather than any actual repair. He set to work anyway, practice mostly, testing how far Garrick's borrowed skill actually extended, whether the guard stance held up against real pressure or only against a startled wolf. He cut a branch to rough length, handed it over in place of a blade, and came at him with a second branch of his own. Garrick didn't lose. Garrick barely moved more than the strike required, weight shifting in increments so small and so precisely timed that Emmerich found himself on his back in the mud within 4 exchanges, staring up at a skull with no expression left to read triumph into. "All right," Emmerich said, from the ground. "All right, you were good." He raised a second skeleton that night, further down the ridge. Smaller frame, cleaner bone, and when it rose, it did nothing at all beyond stand there, patient and hollow, without the particular readiness Garrick carried in every joint. No name suggested itself. Emmerich didn't offer one. Not everyone the ridge had swallowed had been somebody worth remembering in the bone, and the second skeleton's silence felt different from Garrick's. Empty rather than considered. He struck the hammer against his own palm on the walk home, testing the ache that had started living behind his sternum after every raising, a hollow pull like a held breath he couldn't quite finish releasing. The blue-green lines along his wrist stayed visible a full minute longer than they had the week before. He didn't mention that to Garrick either. Some things a man keeps even from the dead. Ren returned 4 days later, as promised, and walked the ridge with a scribe's ledger open against her forearm and a stick in her free hand for probing loose soil. Emmerich came with her, invited himself, framed it as knowing the ground better than any stranger could, and she'd allowed it with an expression that suggested she'd expected exactly that offer and had already decided what to make of it. 41 recorded burials from the old campaign, she said, counting markers as she went. I make it closer to 60 out here, most unrecorded. Sloppy work, whoever kept the original ledger. Wars aren't tidy, no. She crouched at a shallow depression near the tree line. The exact spot Emmerich realized with a cold drop in his stomach, where he'd raised the fresh-buried traveler 4 nights back and put him down again after 3 failed steps. The soil there was disturbed in a way 40-year-old ground should not have been. This one's recent. Weeks, not decades. Animals dig, Emmerich said. Wolves, mostly. Mostly. She looked up at him, and there was nothing accusing in her face at all, which frightened him a great deal more than accusation would have. You've got mud on your boots that matches this exact soil, Smith, and I don't think you were hunting rabbits. He hadn't told anyone that lie except his neighbor. He filed that fact away with the cold, careful part of his mind that had apparently learned something from watching her work. I come out here sometimes, he said, choosing the truth's shape without its substance. It's quiet. Man needs somewhere to think that isn't a forge full of people telling him his hoes aren't good enough. Ren held his eyes a moment longer than the answer strictly required. Then, unexpectedly, something in her posture eased. Not trust, nothing so generous as trust, just the loosening of someone deciding a question wasn't worth pressing today. Fair enough, she said, and closed her ledger. Walk me back before the light goes. I've had enough of this ridge for one afternoon. They walked in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite hostile either, and halfway back to the village, Ren spoke again, quieter, in a tone that had dropped whatever performance the diocese required of her. Do you believe in it? She asked. The church. All of it. The flame, the judgment, the whole architecture. Emmerich thought of smoke going up in a straight black line against a clean morning sky and a night's calm, professional voice saying a single word that had ended his entire childhood in the time it took to speak it. I believe men use it, he said. Whether the rest is true, I couldn't tell you. Ren didn't answer that directly. She touched something at her collar instead, a small locket worn thin at the clasp from years of the same absent motion, and let it go before Emmerich could ask what it held. Careful which of those thoughts you say out loud, she said. Not everyone who asks that question is asking it kindly. She left the ridge road for the village proper without waiting for him to catch the full weight of that warning, and Emmerich stood alone at the crossroads for a long moment, hammer forgotten at his belt, watching a woman who just walked directly over a fresh grave he'd emptied and refilled with his own hands, and hadn't, for reasons he couldn't yet name, told anyone at all. Ren came to the forge 4 more times over the following weeks, and by the 3rd visit she'd stopped pretending she needed an excuse. Your latch is rusted, she said, holding up the door hinge from the smithy's own back room like evidence in a trial. I noticed it last time. Thought I'd mention it before it seizes entirely. You could have just said you wanted to sit by the fire. I could have. She didn't deny it. She sat on the bench near the forge anyway, close enough to the heat that the cold road dust finally left her shoulders, and watched him work a hinge pin with the particular attention she gave everything, counting, cataloging, filing each detail somewhere she could find it again later. He learned things about her in pieces, the way a man learns a language he's not being formally taught. She'd grown up somewhere with real winters, colder than Fallowmere's. She flinched once at a gust through the open shutter, in a way that spoke of a childhood spent bracing against worse. She ate like someone who'd once gone hungry long enough to remember it as a fact rather than a feeling, and she touched the locket at her collar at the exact same moments every time, when the talk turned to family, and only then. He didn't ask about it directly. He'd learned that much from her too, that some doors you don't force, you just make sure the person knows where the handle is. You're better company than the diocese usually sends, he told her on the 4th visit, and meant it more plainly than he'd meant to say out loud. Careful, she said. That's the nicest thing anyone in Fallowmere has said to me. and I've been offered a goat. The goat was a better offer. The goat, she agreed, did not almost let me fall off a horse in front of half the village. But she was smiling when she said it, small and real, and Emmerich found himself thinking, for the length of exactly that one evening, that he might actually be allowed to want something ordinary. A person, a fire, a conversation that didn't have a grave hidden somewhere underneath it. The bells started ringing 2 mornings later, slow and even, the pattern the village used for exactly one thing. Old Yenna was dead. Fever, the healer said, the kind that took the elderly fast once it decided to take them at all. Emmerich heard the news standing in his own doorway, hammer still in hand from the morning's work, and felt something in his chest fold inward that had nothing to do with any magic at all. She'd fed him bread the week his parents burned. Nobody had asked her to. She'd simply seen a 7-year-old boy standing too still in the smoke and decided that was a problem she could solve, even if it was the only one within 100 miles she actually could. He went to the burial that afternoon and said nothing, the way he'd learned to say nothing at most things that mattered, and told himself the ache in his chest was grief and only grief. He went back to the graveyard that night because the wolves had been bold all season, and shallow ground settles slow in cold soil, and somebody ought to check. He heard them before he saw them, low, wet sounds, worse than growling, the ugly business of animals already at work on something that used to be a person. He ran the last stretch without thinking, hammer already swinging up off his belt, and the 2 wolves scattered from the half-opened grave with blood already dark around their muzzles. He didn't remember deciding to strike. His hand simply moved, the way it moved when frustration needed somewhere to go, and the hammer came down against what was left of old Yenna before any part of his mind caught up to stop it. She sat up. Flesh, not bone. The fever hadn't taken enough of her yet for anything else, and Emmerich had one clear, useless thought, this isn't like the others, before her eyes opened and found him directly without the empty wandering the fresh traveler's corpse had managed on the road 2 weeks back. Emmerich, she said. Her voice came out wrong, wet and slow, but the shape of his name in it was entirely, unmistakably hers. You've gone and grown up crooked, same as your father said you would. He couldn't move. His whole body had gone the way ice goes right before it cracks. Still, but wrong, holding a shape it wasn't built to hold much longer. I put bread out for you, she said, the week they burned your mother and father. You remember that, I remember. Your mother's was better. A sound came out of her that might have been meant as a laugh, in whatever was left of her to mean anything by it. I never told her. Tell her for me. If you... The sentence didn't finish. Something behind her eyes clouded, the recognition sliding sideways into confusion, mouth still moving, though the words coming out no longer belonged to any sentence a living woman would have chosen. Emmerich understood, watching that slide happen in real time, exactly what he'd actually done. Not raised her, interrupted her, caught whatever was left of Yenna mid-collapse and forced it to stand up inside a body no longer built to hold a person, and now that person was drowning in it, one clear thought at a time, and he had put her there. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt smaller than anything had ever needed to be in his entire life. I'm sorry, I didn't mean... She reached for him. Not threatening, just reaching, the way a woman reaches for someone she's fed bread to 100 times before, fingers closing slow around empty air a foot short of his sleeve. He struck her again, before the confusion in her face could finish curdling into whatever came after confusion. One hit, aimed true, and she went down soft into the disturbed earth and did not rise a second time. He knelt there a long while, hammer still in his hand, and didn't move even when Garrick's shape settled into the dark beside him without a sound, standing the same patient guard he stood over every threat that came near. Except there was no wolf left to guard against now, nothing left to fight. Just a boy who'd once been given bread for free and a woman who'd finally, mercifully, stopped remembering that he had. He buried her properly before dawn. Deep enough the wolves wouldn't try again. He said the words the village priest would have said, badly, because he only half remembered them, and then he sat at the edge of the grave with the hammer laid flat across his knees, and watched the blue-green lines along his wrist stay lit for the better part of an hour before they finally, slowly, faded. Garrick didn't leave until he did. Neither of them spoke. There was, Emmerich understood now, in a way he hadn't fully understood before that night, nothing left in either of them that could. He didn't tell Ren what had happened when she came by the forge 2 days later and asked, gently, why he looked like a man who hadn't slept. Lost someone, he said, which was true enough to hold, and let it be the whole of the answer. She didn't press. She sat with him by the fire instead, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said nothing at all for a long while, the kind of nothing that isn't emptiness, just two people agreeing without discussing it to let a silence do the work neither of them had words ready for. The fence went down on the north side first. Emmerich heard it from his bed as a single sharp crack, wood giving all at once, and was already pulling boots on before the horn even started. By the time he reached the square, 3 houses had their shutters torn open, and something the size of a plow ox was dragging a goat pen apart with its teeth. Wolves. Or they had been once. The shape was still mostly right, 4 legs and a muzzle and a tail, but nothing that size should have been able to move that fast, and nothing born a wolf should have had eyes that caught torchlight the wrong color entirely, green-black instead of amber. There were at least 6 of them working the square in a loose, patient line, the way hunting animals move when they already know they've won and are only deciding on the order of it. He recognized the eyes before he let himself think through why. He'd seen that same green-black glow along his own wrist every night for 2 months. The village fought back with pitchforks and a single old crossbow that jammed on its second bolt. Emmerich fought with his hammer, ordinary end forward, and put one solid strike into a wolf's flank that should have broken bone and instead barely made it flinch. A man went down 3 feet from him. The farmer, the one who'd complained about the hoe 2 months back, dragged half off his feet by a wolf's jaw around his forearm before 2 neighbors beat it off with a fence rail. He lived. He wouldn't have. Another 10 seconds. Emmerich stood in the middle of the square with blood that wasn't his own soaking into his sleeve and understood, with the cold clarity of a man out of every other option, exactly what he actually had. He ran for the churchyard instead of away from it. The village dead lay closer than the ridge, a season's worth of burials, no more, small enough a graveyard that he knew most of the names without needing to read a single stone. He hit the first grave at a dead sprint, heeded nothing, had no time for fire or ceremony, and struck the disturbed earth with whatever heat the hammer still carried from 2 months of near-nightly use. Old Bram Hallworth came up first, the previous smith. The man Emmerich had apprenticed under for 6 miserable years before the old man's heart gave out that winter. A man who'd told Emmerich more than once that he'd never be worth the iron he wasted. He rose the way Garrick had risen, ready. A blacksmith's stance, weight low, forearms built from 40 years at an anvil, even now that the arms themselves were mostly bone. Emmerich didn't have time to feel anything about that. He hit the next grave, and the next. 5 of them stood by the time the wolves noticed the new arrivals. 5 villagers, dead weeks or months, moving with whatever their bodies had actually been good for while alive rather than whatever weakness had finally killed them. A farmhand who'd broken his neck falling from a hayloft came up swinging a dead man's fists with a farmhand's raw, uncomplicated strength. An old woman who'd died of nothing more dramatic than age moved with a washerwoman's flat-footed balance, hard to knock down, harder to move once she'd planted herself. The wolves that had been winning against pitchforks found something different waiting for them now, and didn't like it. Emmerich struck 2 more graves before his knees actually buckled. Not exhaustion exactly, something colder, the same hollow pull behind his sternum arriving faster and heavier than it ever had with a single raising, let alone 7 in a row. He went down hard on both hands in the churned dirt, vision graying at the edges, and heard rather than saw the fight turn fully in the square behind him. By the time his eyes cleared enough to focus, 4 wolves lay dead or dying, and the other 2 were already running for the tree line, and 7 dead villagers stood in a loose ring around the churchyard gate, waiting, patient, silent, without anywhere else they particularly needed to be. Bram Hallworth's skull turned toward him. Empty sockets. No accusation in them, no gratitude either, nothing at all except the same blank readiness every raised skeleton carried. "Sorry, old man," Emmerich said, voice cracked from more than just the run. Didn't have time to ask. He put them down himself, grave by grave, before the square finished clearing enough for anyone to come looking. It took longer than raising them had, each strike gentler than it needed to be, an apology folded into every blow, until 7 mounds of disturbed earth sat quiet again under a sky just starting to gray toward dawn. He didn't notice the farmer until he was 3 graves in. The man was still on the ground near the fence line where his neighbors had left him, bound rough with someone's torn shirt, too weak to have gone anywhere, and awake enough, eyes wide and unmistakably tracking, to have watched every single strike. Emmerich froze mid-motion, hammer still glowing faint blue-green in the gray pre-dawn light, close enough to Bram Hallworth's half-lowered skeleton that there was no possible story that covered what the man had just seen. Neither of them said anything. The farmer's mouth opened once, closed again, and something passed over his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe. Something closer to a man doing very fast, very frightened arithmetic about exactly what he'd witnessed and exactly what it was worth to exactly the right person. Emmerich finished the last grave in silence and walked straight past him without a word, because there was nothing left to say that either of them would believe. The village spent the morning counting what the wolves had cost. 2 dead outright, 6 wounded, half the northern fence line splintered to kindling, and nobody thought to ask how, precisely, the tide had turned in the churchyard corner. Nobody remembered fighting particularly hard to hold. Nobody except the one man who'd been lying close enough to see. Wren found Emmerich at the forge past noon, splinting a neighbor's wrist with the same steady hands that had shaped 100 hinges, and studied him for a long moment before she spoke. "You look like a man who didn't sleep and did something about it anyway," she said. "Fought wolves, same as everyone." She didn't push, not directly, but her eyes went to the fresh dirt still caked under his fingernails, and then to the churchyard visible through the open smithy door, and something in her expression turned careful in a way it hadn't been the last several visits. "Half the village is saying the fight turned strange in the churchyard corner. Nobody's got a clean story for it. Just strange. People say all sorts after a bad night. They do." She held his gaze a moment longer, weighing something he couldn't read, and then let it go with the same deliberate ease she'd used on the ridge weeks back, filing the question away rather than dropping it. "Get some sleep, Smith. You look like you're about to fall into your own forge." She left without asking the question directly, and Emmerich understood, watching her go, that she hadn't asked it because she already suspected the answer and wasn't ready yet to hear it said out loud where she'd be bound to act on it. He found the farmer again that evening, healing slow in his own bed, wife hovering close enough to hear every word. "I won't say anything," the farmer told him, before Emmerich had managed a single sentence of whatever he'd come to say. His voice shook, not with anger, with the plain fear of a man who'd looked directly at something he had no framework for and desperately wanted to unknow it. "I've got a family, Smith. I don't want the diocese anywhere near this house. Whatever you are, I saw what you did for this village last night. That's the only part I intend to remember." Emmerich believed him. He wanted to believe him, which wasn't quite the same thing, and he understood the difference well enough by now not to trust either feeling completely on its own. He walked home past the churchyard in the last gray light of evening, past 7 mounds of resettled earth that looked, from any ordinary distance, exactly like every other grave in Fallowmere, quiet, undisturbed, keeping whatever they held. He didn't sleep that night either. He sat at his own hearth with the hammer across his knees, watching the faint blue-green light along its head fade slower than it ever had before, and understood, without needing anyone to tell him, that a secret kept by one frightened man in a village this small was never going to stay a secret for very long at all. Wren spent the 3 days after the wolf attack doing the part of her work nobody in Fallowmere had any reason to notice, sitting with the healer while bandages were changed, asking soft questions about the fever season and the burial ground and whether anyone had seen anything strange the night the wolves came through. "Strange how?" the healer asked, hands busy with linen. "However people mean it, when they say it." Wren kept her tone light, the tone of a woman filling a ledger with nothing more dangerous than gossip. "I hear things got confused in the churchyard corner. Ask Devon if you want confusion. He was laid up right at the fence line all night. Man hasn't said 2 words since, and he used to talk your ear off over a bent nail." Wren found Devon, the farmer, the man with the ruined arm, the man Emmerich had visited 2 nights running, sitting in his own doorway that afternoon, and watched his face do something telling the moment she asked, gently, what exactly he remembered from the churchyard corner. He went still, not thinking still, frightened still, the particular stillness of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how much of the truth his mouth could be trusted not to leak. "Nothing," he said. "Fighting wolves. Same as everyone." It was the same sentence Emmerich had used, nearly word for word, and Ren had spent 6 years learning to notice when two separate people rehearsed the identical lie. She didn't press him further. She'd gotten what she needed. Not the truth itself, but confirmation that a truth existed and that at least 2 men in this village had already agreed, without ever discussing it where she could hear, to bury it together. She went to the forge that night without the excuse of a broken hinge. The smithy door stood half open, forge banked low, and Emmerich was bent over the workbench doing something with a whetstone that didn't require the kind of concentration his shoulders suggested it did. He looked up when her shadow crossed the threshold, and whatever he saw in her face made him set the stone down slow, deliberate, both hands visible on the bench. Something moved in the far corner of the smithy, and Ren's whole body went cold before her mind finished identifying why. A skeleton stood there. Not fallen, not staged like some grim decoration. Standing, weight settled, head already turning toward her with an attention that had nothing empty about it at all. Her hand found the knife at her belt before conscious thought caught up, and in the same half-second, her eyes had already mapped the door behind her, the window shutter to her left, the distance to both. "He won't hurt you," Emmerich said. "He hasn't hurt anyone who wasn't trying to hurt me first. That's not actually reassuring, Smith." "No," he admitted, "I don't suppose it is." Ren made herself breathe out slow, hands still on the knife, eyes still on the thing in the corner that hadn't moved another inch since her arrival. Patient, watchful, the way a soldier waits for an order that hadn't come yet and might never need to. "Devon's been lying to me for 3 days," she said when her voice would hold steady, badly. "You taught him the same lie you're telling, word for word, and neither of you thought to wonder how obvious that would look to someone whose actual job is noticing when two stories match too well to be separate." Emmerich didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment instead, and something in his face had gone quieter than fear should have allowed. Flatter, almost, the particular stillness of a man too tired or too changed to manage the panic the moment actually called for. "You're not cataloging burial records," he said. "It wasn't a question. No." She let that sit a moment before she gave him the rest of it. "I work for the chapter house at Kale's Reach, not the archive, the part of it that doesn't keep a public ledger. Villages this far out get watched, quietly, for exactly the kind of thing half of Fallowmere is currently pretending it didn't see 2 nights ago, and now you've seen it yourself. Now I've seen it myself." Neither of them moved for a long moment. The skeleton in the corner held its patient stance, unbothered, and Ren found her eyes drawn back to it, despite every instinct telling her not to look away from the actual danger in the room, which, she was slowly, sickly realizing, might not be standing in the corner at all. "Does it have a name?" she asked, and hated faintly that it was the question that came out first. "Garrick." Emmerich's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. He doesn't remember much. Nothing, really. Just what his hands used to be good at. "And the villagers you raised? The ones in the churchyard corner, did they remember?" The flatness in his face deepened at that, just slightly, and Ren watched something close behind his eyes, like a door easing shut. "One of them did. Once. I put her back down myself. That's meant to comfort me. It's not meant to do anything. It's just what happened." She studied him, really studied him, the way she'd been trained to study a subject before deciding what to write in a report that other people's lives would eventually depend on, and noticed for the first time the faint blue-green thread along his wrist where his sleeve had ridden up, visible even in the smithy's low light, fading too slowly to be anything but real. "That's costing you something," she said. "I can see it costing you something. It costs whatever it costs." He said it simply, without self-pity, which frightened her far more than if he'd tried to make her feel sorry for him. "I stopped keeping score a while back. Didn't seem like it would change the total either way." Ren's hand finally left the knife at her belt, though she couldn't have said exactly when she'd decided that was safe to do. "I'm supposed to report this," she said. "Tonight, if I did my duty properly. There's a rider at the chapter house who leaves for Kale's Reach every 3 days whether I've got news or not, and he leaves again tomorrow morning. Are you going to?" She didn't answer immediately. Her hand went to her collar instead, to the locket she wore and never opened where anyone could see, and Emmerich watched her thumb move over the clasp the same absent way it always did, worn smooth from years of the identical motion. "I don't know yet," she said finally, and the honesty of it seemed to cost her something too. "Give me the night. Don't do anything foolish before I've decided, and I won't do anything foolish either." She left without waiting for him to agree, boots quick against the dirt yard, and Emmerich stood at the smithy door a long while after her shadow had gone, watching the dark where she disappeared with the stillness of a man who had just handed his entire life to someone else's judgment and had no way left to take it back. Garrick's skull turned toward him once the door swung fully shut. No question in the motion. Skeletons didn't ask questions. But Emmerich found himself answering one anyway, quiet, to the only company left in the room who couldn't repeat it to anyone. "I know," he said. "I know exactly how that looked." He picked the whetstone back up, though his hands had stopped pretending to need it, and turned it slowly between his fingers instead, not sharpening anything at all, just kneading the way he always kneaded. Something to hold on to while the rest of the night decided what it was going to do with him. Ren wrote 2 reports that night. She wrote them side by side on the same narrow table, in the same careful hand, and by dawn she still hadn't decided which one the writer was going to carry. The first was short and true. Unregistered necromantic practice confirmed, Falomir. Subject identified. Awaiting instruction. 4 lines. It would take the writer 2 days to reach Kale's Reach, and it would take the chapter house far less than that to decide what came next. The second was shorter and false. Nothing of note. Records incomplete but unremarkable. Recommend closing the inquiry. She'd written that one from memory, the exact bloodless phrasing the diocese preferred for a village not worth further attention, and hated how easily the lie had come out of her once she'd let herself start it. She found Emmerich at the forge an hour after sunrise, both papers folded into her coat, and didn't say anything at all until he'd banked the morning fire and given her his full attention. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before I decide anything else." She unclasped the locket at her collar, the one she'd touched 100 times across a dozen visits and never once opened where he could see, and set it open on the workbench between them. A boy's face looked up from inside it, painted small and careful, maybe 12 years old in the portrait, with her same steady eyes and none of her guardedness yet worn into them. "My brother, Tobin." She said the name like it cost her something just to shape it out loud. "He's at the cloister school in Kale's Reach. Has been for 5 years, since our parents didn't survive a bad winter and the diocese offered to take him in as an act of charity." "That's not charity," Emmerich said. It wasn't a question either. "No." Her voice stayed level, the practiced level of someone who'd said this exact sentence in her own head 1,000 times before ever risking it out loud. "It's leverage. They recruited me 2 years later, never said it outright. The chapter house doesn't need to say things outright, that's the whole design of it. But the message was clear enough without words. I do the work well, Tobin stays comfortable. I stop doing the work, or I do it badly, and comfortable stops being guaranteed." Emmerich looked at the small painted face a long moment, and Ren watched him do something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not the careful sympathy most people offered when a story this heavy landed in front of them, but a kind of recognition instead, quiet and pointed toward exactly what he understood about people the church decided to use. "They took my parents outright," he said. "Yours, they just took slowly. I don't know which is worse. Neither do I." She closed the locket, gentle, the way she always closed it, and finally let the true weight of the last 2 days show plainly on her face. "If I send the true report, they move on you within the week. Probably send someone far more capable than a records clerk to manage it. And if you send the false one, then I've lied to the chapter house about a confirmed necromancer, and if anyone ever finds that out, if you slip again, if another villager talks, if anything at all goes wrong after I've sworn this village clean, Tobin pays for it. Not me first. Him first. That's how they'd want it to hurt the most." She laid both reports on the workbench, side by side, true and false, and looked at them the way a woman looks at a debt she already knows she can't actually afford either way. "Why are you telling me this?" Emmerich asked, "instead of just deciding it on your own and riding out before I ever knew which way you'd gone? Because you'd have deserved to know which choice put you in danger and which one put my brother in danger before either of us has to live with it." She met his eyes squarely. And because I think, if I'm honest, I wanted someone to tell me I wasn't a fool for even considering the second report at all. He didn't tell her that. Emmerich had learned, across 2 months of learning what his own hands were actually capable of, that easy reassurance from someone who didn't have to pay the same price wasn't worth the breath it cost to say. "I can't tell you it's not foolish," he said instead. "I can tell you Garrick stood over me every single night since I raised him, for no reason except that some part of what he used to be decided I was worth guarding. I don't know what that's worth against a brother in a cloister. I just know it's the only thing I've got to offer, and it's yours if you want it." Ren picked up the true report first. Read it once more. Slow. The 4 clean lines that would end this quietly and completely, and leave her exactly as safe as the chapter house had always promised her she'd be, provided she did her job. Then she picked up the false one instead, folded it twice, and held it out to him. "Burn this with me," she said. "I want to watch it happen. I don't trust myself to feel like I actually chose it unless I see the fire take it." He fed both papers into the forge together, true report and false, side by side, because there was no version of tonight where either one survived once the choice was actually made. The flame took the true one fast, ordinary paper curling black in seconds. The false report, the one she'd carry to the writer come morning dressed up as the honest truth, she watched separately, burning a copy of her own lie just to prove to herself she understood exactly what she was choosing to become. "They'll ask why it took 2 extra days to send anything at all," Emmerich said. "I'll tell them the records were a mess," which happens to be true, technically, if you don't look too closely at which records I mean. She stood close enough in the low light of the forge that Emmerich could see the exact moment the fear in her finally settled into something steadier. Not gone. Nothing that heavy simply left a person, but folded down small enough to carry, rather than left to run loose and ruin every decision underneath it. "Tobin doesn't know any of this," she said, quiet now, mostly to herself. "He thinks I catalog records for a living. Boring, safe work. I've let him believe that for 2 years, because the alternative was watching him understand exactly what kind of leash he actually is." "You'll get him out," Emmerich said. "Eventually, whatever this turns into. You don't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I've started believing things I can't prove lately. Doesn't seem worth stopping now." She laughed at that, short, surprised out of her, the first sound in the whole conversation that hadn't been carefully weighed before she let it out. And something in the smithy's cramped, ordinary dark shifted into a kind of quiet neither of them rushed to fill. She stayed until the false report needed to leave with the morning rider, and when she finally did go, she paused at the door long enough to press her palm flat against Emmerich's chest. Not an embrace, nothing so simple as that. Just a hand set deliberately over the place where the blue-green lines lived closest to the surface, as if she could feel, through skin and shirt, exactly what the choice she just made was costing him too. "Don't waste what I just spent on you," she said. "I won't." She left. Emmerich watched the false report ride out of Fallowmere an hour later, small and folded and carried by a man who had no idea he was delivering a lie that a woman's brother's life was quietly, permanently balanced on top of, and understood, watching the dust settle behind the rider's horse, that whatever came next was no longer a secret he was keeping alone. 3 weeks passed without a single wolf, a single grave, a single reason for either of them to raise anything at all, and Emmerich let himself believe, for the length of exactly those 3 weeks, that the worst of it might actually be behind him. Ren came to the forge most evenings now, no excuse needed anymore, no hinge to fix. She'd taken to reading old ledgers by the forge light while he worked, correcting his sums when his own arithmetic ran sloppy, and twice she'd fallen asleep in the chair by the fire before he'd worked up the nerve to wake her, rather than simply bank the coals quiet and let her stay. Garrick stood watch at the tree line most nights, patient as ever, and the village had settled back into the ordinary rhythm of planting season, the churchyard corner already growing over with the same grass as everywhere else. None of it lasted the way either of them had hoped it might. The trouble started 3 days' ride east, in a market town neither of them would ever set foot in, with a trader named Corley Ash, who'd passed through Fallowmere once, briefly, weeks before the wolves ever came. Sold rope and lamp oil, slept one night at the inn, and left the next morning without ever hearing a word about churchyards or hammers or anything worth remembering. What he did hear, secondhand and badly, was a scrap of tavern gossip the innkeeper's wife had let slip while pouring his ale. Something about the Smith's strange hours, about wolves that had somehow lost a fight they should have won. About a churchyard corner the whole village had stopped mentioning by mutual, uneasy agreement. Corley Ash repeated it 3 weeks later in a different tavern, in a market town well inside diocese territory, to nobody in particular, purely as the kind of idle strangeness a man mentions to fill a quiet evening. A younger man 2 tables over, not church himself, but church adjacent, the kind of informant every chapter house kept scattered through every market square worth watching, wrote the name Fallowmere down on a scrap of paper before he'd finished his own drink, and carried it to the chapter house the following morning as one small item among a dozen others. It sat in a stack of similar reports for 6 days before anyone with real authority read it properly. Sir Baldric Rennick read it on the 7th, standing in the chapter house armory with his sword laid flat across a cleaning cloth, the same ritual he performed after every judgment he carried out, and, increasingly, on days when he hadn't carried out any judgment at all, a habit that had stopped being about the blade a long time ago and become, instead, the only thing left that reliably quieted whatever still moved underneath his own calm. He read the village name twice before it settled. Fallowmere. He'd been there before. 17 years back, a smaller posting then, sent to confirm a report of forbidden charms, small carved luck tokens, harmless by any honest measure, but the diocese hadn't asked his opinion on honesty, only his obedience, and he'd given it the same way he'd given it every time since. A smith and his wife, both marked heretic on evidence thinner than the cloth currently in his hands. A boy, 7 or 8, who'd vanished into the smoke before anyone thought to account for him. He hadn't thought about the boy in years. He found reading the name Fallowmere now that he still didn't particularly want to. Rumor of necromantic activity, the report read, in the flat clerk's hand, every chapter house report shared regardless of which clerk had actually written it. Unverified, source second-hand. Local church liaison filed a prior inquiry as unremarkable. Rennick set the cloth down and read that last line a 3rd time. A liaison had already been there, had already looked and found nothing and closed the matter clean, which meant either the rumor was exactly the idle nothing it sounded like, or someone with proper training had walked directly past whatever was actually happening and either missed it or chose not to see it. He didn't trust coincidence. 17 years of confirming other men's suspicions had taught him that coincidence was usually just a lie that hadn't been examined closely enough yet. He picked the sword back up and ran the cloth along its length one final time, slow, methodical, until the steel held no trace of whatever it had last been used for, and set it into its sheath with the same care he gave every decision that mattered. He would go himself, not delegate it to whichever junior ashblade happened to be idle that week. A liaison had already missed something once in that village. He intended to be the one who didn't miss it twice. He gave the order to ready his horse before he'd finished forming the thought into words, the way a man moves when a decision has already made itself somewhere beneath conscious will, and told himself, riding out of Kale's reach 3 days later, that this was simple thoroughness. Duty, properly discharged. Nothing more complicated than that. He did not let himself examine closely why the prospect of returning to that particular village sat in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed and never quite managed to pass. Fallowmere noticed the first stranger 4 days after Rennick left the chapter house. Not Rennick himself, not yet, but a rider in plain travel clothes who asked careful questions at the mill about the wolf attack from a season back, about whether the churchyard had settled properly, about a smith who made hoes and, occasionally, according to rumor, something a good deal stranger. Wren heard about the stranger before Emmerich did. She found him at the forge that evening, with her face already carrying the particular stillness she wore when a piece of information had landed somewhere serious. Someone's asking questions, she said, not local, careful about it too, the kind of careful that means he's done this before. Emmerich's hand found the hammer at his belt without any conscious decision to reach for it, turning it once through his fingers, slow, the old habit finding him exactly when the old habit was needed most. Chapter house? I don't know yet. Could be nothing. Could be exactly what it looks like. She crossed to the window, checked the yard outside from habit rather than any real alarm, and came back to stand close enough that he could feel the tension held tight through her shoulders. I sent a false report 6 weeks ago. If this is what I think it is, someone didn't believe it, or someone else talked. Corley Ash, Emmerich said, though he had no way of knowing the name, no way of knowing any of it, just the flat, cold certainty of a man who'd learned to expect the worst version of any given morning. Some trader, some tavern, it doesn't matter who, it was always going to be somebody. Ren didn't argue that. She'd known it too, from the very first night she'd burned 2 reports instead of 1, and some part of her had simply been waiting, these 6 quiet weeks, for the debt to finally come due. If it's a full investigation, she said, they'll send someone with real authority, not a liaison, an ash blade. Emmerich set the hammer down on the workbench, deliberate, and looked at it a long moment before he answered. The same tool that had raised Garrick, raised Yenna, raised 7 village dead in a single desperate night, sitting ordinary and quiet in the evening light like it had never done any of it at all. Then we'll know soon enough which one, he said, and we'll deal with whatever comes after that when it actually arrives. Neither of them said Rennick's name that night. Neither of them had any reason yet to think it, and some part of Emmerich, some part he didn't examine too closely, the same way Rennick, 3 days out from Kale's reach and closing steadily, didn't examine why this particular road felt heavier under his horse's hooves than any other assignment had in years, already understood, without proof, exactly whose shadow was about to fall back over Fallowmere for the second time in his life. Rennick arrived on a gray morning with 3 soldiers behind him and no announcement ahead of him at all, and by the time Emmerich heard the horses in the square, half the village had already gathered to watch a church escort dismount in front of the well. He didn't ask for the smith by name. That was the first thing Emmerich noticed, watching from the smithy doorway with his hands gone cold. Rennick already knew exactly which questions to ask and exactly which man in the crowd to watch while he asked them, and he never once looked toward the forge at all, as if he already had all the confirmation he needed and was simply choosing his own moment to use it. "Wolves," Rennick said, addressing the gathered square in a voice pitched to carry without needing to shout. "A season back. I understand the fight turned strange in the churchyard corner. I'd like to hear from whoever remembers it best." Nobody spoke. The silence held the particular texture of an entire village agreeing, without a word passed between them, to protect the same secret at once. Rennick let the silence sit a long moment, unbothered, the way a man waits who has never once needed to hurry toward an answer he already expects to receive eventually. Then he looked directly at Devon. "You were wounded that night," Rennick said. "Close to the churchyard fence, if my information's accurate. I'd think a man that close to something strange would remember it clearly." Devon's ruined arm hung at his side, healed crooked, and his face went the same frightened, still Ren had described weeks before. The stillness of a man doing very fast arithmetic about exactly how much silence his body could afford to keep. "Nothing strange," Devon said. "Fought wolves, same as everyone." Rennick studied him a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger, nothing so simple. Disappointment, maybe, the specific, tired disappointment of a man who has heard this exact lie in this exact tone more times across 17 years than he cared to count. "I don't believe you," he said, gentle as a man remarking on weather. "And I think, given time enough, you'll find that unhelpful for your family." He nodded once to the soldier beside him, and the soldier's hand closed around Devon's good arm before anyone in the square had time to understand what was actually happening. Emmerich was moving before he decided to move at all. "Let him go." His voice cracked across the square louder than he'd meant it to, and every head turned at once, Rennick's included, calm and unhurried, finding the smithy doorway for the first time since his arrival. "He doesn't know anything. I do." The square went silent in a different way now, the silence of people realizing exactly what they'd all agreed, without ever saying so aloud, to protect. Rennick's eyes moved over Emmerich slowly, face, hands, the hammer still hanging from his belt, and something crossed behind them that Emmerich couldn't read and didn't have time to try, because the soldier had already released Devon and drawn a blade instead. "Then we'll speak," Rennick said, and drew his own sword with the same unhurried care he gave everything, properly, smith to whatever you actually are. Emmerich had 2 months of desperate practice against wolves and a blacksmith's arms built from years at an anvil. Rennick had 17 years of trained, sanctioned violence and a stillness in combat that made every one of Emmerich's swings look like exactly what it was. A man who had never once been taught to fight, trying anyway because the alternative was worse. The first exchange put Emmerich on the ground. The second opened a line across his forearm deep enough to end the fight outright if Rennick had wanted it ended. He didn't. He stepped back instead, sword lowered, watching Emmerich drag himself upright with an expression that had gone unreadable again, patient, waiting to see what a losing man actually did with the last of his own choices. Garrick came off the tree line at a dead run. He'd been watching from the ridge close enough to reach the square in seconds once the fighting started, and he put himself squarely between Emmerich and Rennick's blade with no order given and no hesitation spared to consider whether the order was needed. Bone met steel. Rennick's sword, forged and blessed for exactly this purpose, bit into Garrick's shoulder with a sound like a tree splitting, and for the first time since Emmerich had raised him, Garrick staggered. He held his ground anyway. Weight low, guard reformed even with half his shoulder in ruin, the same stance he'd carried against a wolf months back. Except a wolf had read that stance and retreated, and Rennick read it and simply pressed harder. Trained hard enough to know exactly which angle would finish what the first strike had started. The second blow put Garrick down. Emmerich screamed something that wasn't a word at all and got one hand on the hammer at his belt, but Rennick was already turning back toward him, sword still red, and there was no version of the next several seconds that ended with Emmerich still standing. It ended instead with Ren's arrow. She'd been on the mill roof the whole encounter, bow in hand, and the shaft took the soldier nearest Devon through the shoulder before anyone accounted for where it had come from. Not aimed at Rennick himself, she'd never have made that shot and known it, but enough to fracture the escort's formation for exactly the 2 seconds Emmerich needed to drag Devon clear of the second soldier's blade. It wasn't enough for Devon. The soldier's sword found him anyway in the confusion, a wild, undirected stroke meant for someone else entirely, and Devon went down in the churned mud of the square with the same stillness he'd worn his whole conversation with Rennick, except final now, no arithmetic left to run. Rennick's blade stopped an inch from Emmerich's throat. He held it there a long moment, breathing hard, and something in his face, some crack in the calm that had carried him through every second of the last few minutes, opened just wide enough for Emmerich to see straight through it, to something that looked absurdly, almost like recognition. "Your eyes," Rennick said, quiet now, meant for no one but Emmerich to hear. "I've seen that exact look before. A boy, behind a rain barrel, watching his whole life burn." Emmerich didn't answer. Couldn't. Blood from his own forearm ran warm down his wrist, mixing with the faint blue-green lines that hadn't fully faded from the fight, and Rennick's eyes tracked that mixing color with an expression that had stopped being calm entirely. He withdrew the blade. "Not today," he said, stepping back, voice gone rough in a way Emmerich hadn't heard from him even once across the whole encounter. "Gather your dead, Smith. I'll return when I've decided what I actually saw here." He called his soldiers back, the wounded one, the one who'd killed Devon, both of them, formation reforming with the same discipline it had broken with, and rode out of Fallowmere without looking back even once, leaving behind a square gone silent with grief and a boy grown into a man who had just watched, for the second time in his life, that exact same rider leave a body behind him on his way out of this village. Ren reached him first, sliding down from the mill roof, and said nothing at all as she pressed a torn strip of cloth hard against the wound on his arm. Garrick lay unmoving where he'd fallen, shoulder shattered, bone dark where Rennick's blessed steel had scorched through the enchantment itself, alive, if that word meant anything for what he was, but broken in a way Emmerich understood, looking at him. Wasn't going to simply mend with time the way flesh might have. Devon's wife found her husband's body while Emmerich still knelt in the mud beside Garrick, and the sound she made didn't carry any words in it at all. Just the flat, complete grief of a woman whose family had just paid in full for a secret that had never once been hers to keep. Emmerich closed his eyes and didn't open them again for a long while, hammer still clenched useless in his fist, and understood, kneeling there in a square gone quiet, except for one woman's grief, that whatever came next was no longer a question of if the church returned. It was only ever going to be a question of how many more graves Fallowmere dug before it did. They didn't go back for the village. Ren wouldn't let him, not for 3 days. Not until the smoke smell had finally worked itself out of his clothes and the wound on his forearm had closed enough to stop soaking through its binding by midday. "Rennick will have men watching the road," she said on the second night, feeding the small fire they didn't dare build too high. "If you go back now, you're not saving anyone. You're just giving him the second thing he came for." Emmerich didn't argue. He'd stopped, somewhere in the last 3 days, being entirely certain his own judgment could be trusted with anything as important as other people's safety. "I need a plan that isn't just grief with a hammer attached to it," he said finally, "because that's what I've got right now, and it's not going to be enough." Ren pulled a folded map from her coat. Old, creased soft from years of handling, the kind of map an archive clerk might actually have carried for entirely legitimate reasons, which was, he realized, likely exactly why she'd never once needed to hide it from anyone. 3 sites. I've read enough diocese records over the years to know where the old wars actually happened, not just the ones that made it into the songs. She traced a route south and east with one finger, 3 separate marks, each one a half-day's ride or more from the last, Kelmore Vale. A mercenary company called the Ashen Ledger died there defending a border nobody remembers the name of anymore, 40-some years back. Full company, near 200 men, buried in a single mass grave because nobody wanted to pay for anything better. Her finger moved south. Thornwick Field, older. A siege captain named Harwick held a fortress there for 6 weeks against orders to surrender, saved the garrison, and got hanged for defying command the moment the siege actually broke. His own side did that to him. Buried outside the walls, no marker, because the diocese didn't want anyone remembering a man who disobeyed properly. And the third I'd rather not need. She folded the map again before he could see it clearly. Let's start with the 2 that don't require quite so much desperation first. Kelmore Vale took 4 days to reach, traveling careful and slow, avoiding the main roads Rennick's men would be watching. The mass grave itself sat under nothing more than a low grass hill, unmarked, the kind of place a man could walk across a dozen times without ever suspecting what lay beneath his boots. Emmerich worked through the night, heating the hammer over a fire built small and shielded from any distant road, and learned something new about the cost of what he was doing with every single strike. 200 men was too many to raise cleanly, and he understood that within the first hour, the hollow pull behind his sternum arriving faster with each successive strike, the blue-green lines climbing higher up his arm than they'd ever reached before, visible now past his elbow even in daylight. He forced himself to stop at 40. 40 felt, by the end of that first night, like far more than his body had any right to have survived. 40 was still an army no ordinary village smith had any business commanding. They rose in loose formation without needing to be told, old mercenary discipline surfacing through bone the same way it always did, and Emmerich stood in the middle of them at dawn, exhausted past the point of proper thought, understanding for the first time the actual weight of what he'd just built. Thornwick Field took another 6 days, further south, and the grave itself proved harder to find than Wren's records had suggested, an unmarked scar of earth outside crumbling fortress walls that had clearly once meant to erase every trace of the man buried there. Captain Harwick rose alone, no company beside him, and moved with an authority the moment he stood that made even the 40 mercenaries from Kelmore Vale shift their loose formation into something far more disciplined without any order passing between any of them at all. He turned toward Emmerich first, skull tilting in an unmistakable question, and Emmerich understood, watching that single small motion, that whatever had made this man defy an order to abandon a garrison 40 years ago hadn't fully left the bone even now. "I need you to help me hold something," Emmerich said, feeling foolish explaining strategy to a skeleton with no ears, and continued anyway, because talking had become, across these last months, the only way he knew how to think clearly through anything at all. "A church, trained soldiers. I don't know how many yet. I've got 40 men who used to be mercenaries and no idea how to actually use them properly." Harwick's skull turned toward the loose formation of Ashen Ledger dead, studied them a long moment, and then, without any hammer strike required, without anything Emmerich had done at all, the 40 mercenaries shifted formation again, tighter, better spaced, arranged into something that looked, even to Emmerich's untrained eye, far more like a unit prepared to actually survive a real engagement than the loose crowd they'd been an hour before. "That's new," Wren said, quiet, watching from the tree line. "I don't think I did that," Emmerich said. "No, I don't think you did either." They gathered living allies, too, over the following 2 weeks. Quieter work, harder in its own way, moving between villages that had felt Rennick's particular brand of justice at some point across the years, and finding, in each one, at least a handful of people willing to risk everything for a chance to actually answer it. a blacksmith's widow from a village 3 valleys over, whose husband had been executed on evidence thinner than Emmerich's own parents had been. A pair of brothers who'd lost their sister to a purge Rennick had personally overseen a decade back, none of them soldiers. All of them furious in the slow, patient way people become furious when grief has had years to settle into something harder and more useful than simple rage. 23 living volunteers by the end of the second week. 41 dead, counting Harwick, counting the 2 skeletons Emmerich had raised weeks back on the old ridge that had somehow, through some loyalty he still didn't fully understand, found their own way to rejoin the growing camp on their own. It wasn't an army by any measure Rennick's chapter house would have recognized as one. It was, Emmerich understood, standing at the edge of their camp one evening watching living volunteers drill half-heartedly under Harwick's silent, exacting correction exactly what he actually had, and it would have to be enough, because there was nothing left in the world he could trade for anything more. He buried something for Garrick that same evening, alone, away from the camp, no bones to bury, nothing physical left of him beyond scattered fragments they hadn't been able to carry away from the square. He buried the broken sword marker instead, the one that had first told him where to dig, carried all this way in his own pack without ever quite admitting to himself why. "You'd have organized this better than I have," he said, kneeling in the dirt, hammer resting loose in his other hand. "You always did stand between me and whatever was coming before I even finished being afraid of it." The camp behind him carried on in its ordinary evening rhythm. 41 dead standing patient watch, 23 living volunteers eating a thin supper around low fires. Wren, somewhere among them, checking supply counts with the same careful attention she'd once used to catalog lies for a chapter house that had never deserved her loyalty in the first place. Emmerich set the broken sword upright in the fresh-turned earth, the way it must have stood once, decades ago, over a grave nobody had bothered marking properly. "We're not big enough to win outright," he said to no one who could answer, "but we're big enough that Rennick's going to have to actually work for it now. That's more than I had a season ago. I intend to make it count." He stood, hammer at his belt, and walked back toward the fires to finish whatever preparation the coming fight would still demand of him. Word reached them 11 days later, carried by one of the brothers who'd lost their sister to Rennick's purge and had taken to scouting the roads in exchange for a place at the fires. Rennick was marching back toward Fallowmere with far more than 6 men this time. "Full chapter house muster," the brother said, breathless from the ride. "I counted past 80 before I lost count properly. Regular soldiers, not just ashblades. They're not hunting one smith anymore. They're making an example." Wren had the map spread flat before he'd finished speaking, tracing the road with one finger already gone tight and pale at the knuckle. "They'll reach the village in 3 days," she said, "maybe less if Rennick pushes the pace." Harwick's skull turned toward the map as well, and though he had no voice to offer with it, his bony finger came down on a stretch of ground half a mile short of Fallowmere's outer fence. The narrow rise where the old north road bent hard around a stand of dense trees before opening onto the village proper. "He's saying we fight there," Emmerich said, working out the silent argument the same way he'd learned to work out most of Harwick's intentions by now, not in the village itself. Wren studied the spot Harwick had marked. A choke point. 80 men can't spread their numbers wide enough to matter if the ground won't let them. It funnels them in a column we can meet a few ranks at a time instead of all at once. And it keeps the fighting off the villagers, Emmerich said, understanding the rest of it without needing it spelled out further. Whoever's left in Fallowmere doesn't need this brought back to their own doorstep twice. They moved the camp that same afternoon. 41 dead, 23 living, everything they'd built across 2 hard weeks funneled toward a stretch of road most of them had never seen, to make a stand for a village most of the living volunteers had never once set foot in. Emmerich found Wren alone that night, checking arrow fletching by firelight with the same careful attention she gave every task that mattered. "You don't have to be at the front of this," he said. "Neither do you." She didn't look up from the fletching. "But we both know exactly where we're each going to be standing tomorrow, so let's not waste tonight pretending otherwise." He sat beside her instead of arguing further, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, the kind of quiet 2 people share when there's nothing left worth saying that the coming morning wouldn't say more honestly on its own. "Tobin," she said eventually, "quiet. If this goes wrong. There's a woman in Kale's Reach, runs a bakery 2 streets from the cloister gate. She's not church, never has been, just kind in a way that's rare that close to a chapter house. If I don't make it back for him, she'll know where to send word. You'll make it back for him. You don't know that. No, he admitted, the same honest answer he'd given her once before, in a smithy that felt like a lifetime ago now. But I've started believing things I can't prove. Doesn't seem worth stopping tonight. She laughed, quiet and brief, and reached over to close her hand around his. Not the practiced grip of an agent checking a weapon, just a hand, ordinary and warm, holding onto another one in the dark before a morning neither of them could promise the other they'd survive. Rennick's column came around the bend in the road 2 mornings later, exactly where Harwick had said it would, and the choke point did precisely what Ren had promised. 80 soldiers compressed into a column no more than 6 wide. Unable to bring their full numbers to bear against a line that had chosen its ground with more care than they'd apparently expected a dead siege captain and a village smith to manage. The first exchange was arrows, Ren's volley finding gaps in armor at the column's front before the fighting ever closed to blade range, and Emmerich watched 2 soldiers fall before either side had spoken a single word. Then it was simply fighting, the way fighting always was once it actually started. Too fast, too loud, too many things happening at once for any clean accounting of who struck whom or in what order. Harwick's 40 held the choke point center with a discipline that made Rennick's own soldiers hesitate at the first clash, muscle memory 40 years dead, answering trained strikes with an economy that cost the church's front rank dearly in the fight's opening minutes. The living volunteers held the flanks where the trees narrowed the ground further, the blacksmith's widow fighting with a fury that put more than one trained soldier on the ground before the morning was an hour old. Emmerich fought near the center, hammer in hand, and understood within the first exchanges that he was still not, by any honest measure, a soldier, but he didn't need to be, not entirely. Not with 40 men who'd once been exactly that, standing in a wall around him and a captain's silent tactics keeping the line from ever fully buckling. Rennick himself held back from the column's front for the battle's first hour, watching from horseback with the same cold, methodical attention he brought to everything, and Emmerich caught his eye once across the chaos of the choke point, a long moment, brief and charged. 2 men who'd been circling each other's shadow for 17 years, finally close enough to end it properly. Rennick didn't come forward yet. He was still counting, still calculating the way he always calculated before he committed to anything. And Emmerich understood, watching him hold that horse steady at the column's rear, that whatever came next would arrive on Rennick's schedule and no one else's. The choke point held through the morning's worst of it, cost mounting on both sides in the ordinary brutal arithmetic of any real fight. 2 of the living volunteers down, one of them the younger of the 2 brothers, a wound to the throat that left no question of survival. 6 of Harwick's 40 scattered into pieces that wouldn't rise again, old bone finally failing under strikes it couldn't fully absorb no matter how disciplined the soldier wielding it had once been. Emmerich felt each loss arrive somewhere behind his ribs, distant and blunted in a way that frightened him far more than sharp grief would have. The same flatness that had been creeping into him for months now, no longer subtle, no longer something he could pretend was simply exhaustion. By midday, the column had pushed halfway through the choke point despite everything, numbers beginning to tell the way numbers eventually always did against a smaller line no matter how well it held. And Ren fought her way back to Emmerich's side between exchanges, breathing hard, an arrow already spent and another notched. "We can't hold this line indefinitely," she said. "Not against 80. We're bleeding faster than we're breaking them. I know. Rennick's still holding back. I know that too." Emmerich looked past her, toward the horsemen still watching from the column's rear, patient as ever, waiting for whatever moment he'd already decided would matter most. "He wants me and no one else. He's not going to commit fully until he's certain that's what he's actually getting." Ren's eyes found his, steady despite the chaos still moving around them both. "Then give it to him," she said. "Before this line breaks under weight, it was never built to hold forever." Emmerich looked at the choke point holding, barely, 40 dead and 21 living standing against a column that outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1, and understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried him through every hard decision since a boy's grave first opened under his hammer, exactly what the next several minutes were going to require of him. He stepped forward, out of the line, into the open ground where Rennick could see him clearly. "You want me?" Emmerich called out, voice carrying flat and hard across the noise of the fight still raging along the rest of the choke point. "Here I am. Come finish what you started 17 years ago, or call your men back and let the rest of this end today instead of dragging on until everyone I've got left is dead in this road." Rennick's horse went still. For a long moment, nothing in the whole choke point moved at the pace it had a right to, the fighting continuing somewhere at the edges of Emmerich's awareness, distant and unimportant, while the man who'd burned his parents finally, after 17 years, looked at him directly and made his decision. Rennick dismounted. "Fall back," he told his men, voice carrying with the same effortless authority it always had. "Hold the column. This part isn't yours to finish." He drew his sword, the same blade he'd cleaned 100 times over the years for reasons that had stopped, a long time ago, having anything honest left to do with duty, and walked forward alone into the open ground between the two lines. Emmerich spun the hammer once through his fingers. Old habit, steady despite everything, the only thing his hands had ever reliably known how to do when the rest of him had nothing left to offer the moment. Then he walked forward too, and the choke point's fighting seemed, for one suspended breath, to hold its noise entirely for what was about to happen in the space between them. Rennick struck first, and struck well, and within 4 exchanges, Emmerich understood exactly how badly this was going to go if the fight stayed a fight between a trained knight and a man who'd spent his whole life shaping metal rather than swinging it at other people. The blade opened his shoulder on the 5th exchange, his hip on the 7th. By the 10th, he was on one knee in the dirt with blood running warm down his ribs, hammer still gripped in a hand that had started shaking without his permission, and Rennick stood over him with the same terrible professional calm he'd worn 17 years ago in a burning doorway. "You fought harder than I expected," Rennick said. "It changes nothing." Emmerich's vision blurred. Focused, blurred again, and in the narrow window where it held steady, he found himself looking, without meaning to, at the sword still raised above him. Not the man holding it, not the blow about to fall, but the blade itself. Catching morning light along an edge that had been wetted and cleaned and wetted again 10,000 times across 17 years by the same hand moving in the same exact motion. A smith's eye doesn't stop being a smith's eye just because its owner is dying. He saw the flaw the way he'd have seen it on any blade brought to his own forge for repair. A hairline seam near the base, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime learning what metal looks like right before it fails, thinned by the identical stroke of the identical cloth run along the identical 2 inches of steel every single day for 17 years. Rennick's own ritual, the one thing that had kept him steady enough to keep doing what the church asked of him, had been quietly eating his own weapon alive the entire time. Emmerich didn't try to block the next strike. He caught it instead, hammer angled wrong on purpose, forcing Rennick's blade into a twist no honest parry should have required, and the sword answered exactly the way 17 years of the same obsessive motion had guaranteed it eventually would. It broke 2 inches from the hilt, the same 2 inches Rennick had polished smooth as glass 1,000 separate mornings, and the top half spun away into the dirt while Rennick stood frozen for 1 full second staring at a stub of ruined steel in his own hand like it had betrayed him personally. Which, in the only way that actually mattered, it had. Emmerich didn't press the advantage. He didn't have the strength left to, and something else had already pulled his attention away entirely. A sound from the choke point behind him, Ren's voice cutting through the noise of the fight, high and desperate in a way he'd never once heard from her before. The line was breaking. He turned enough to see it. The column pushing through at last, numbers finally telling against a smaller force that had held for hours past what anyone should reasonably have asked of it, Harwick's remaining dead falling back rank by rank. Ren cut off near the tree line with 3 soldiers closing on her position and no clean way out. Emmerich had a choice, and he understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried him through every hard decision since a boy's grave first opened under his hammer, that he only had time to make the right one and not the comfortable one. He turned from Rennick entirely, dropped to one knee, and drove the hammer into the earth itself. He didn't reach for 1 grave, or 2, or 40 carefully chosen legends worth the cost of raising them properly. He reached for everything. Every soldier who'd fallen on that road since dawn, church and rebel both, every scrap of the dead lying scattered across a battlefield that had been feeding him information for hours, without his ever needing to strike a single one of them individually. He opened himself to all of it at once, deliberately, knowing exactly what a debt of that size would actually cost before he ever let himself reach for it. The ground answered. Bodies rose across the entire choke point at once. Dozens of them, church soldier and rebel volunteer alike, pulled up together into something that no longer recognized which side either had died on, and the sheer scale of it staggered the remaining column into a chaos no living commander could have organized fast enough to counter. Emmerich felt the cost arrive not as pain, not even as the familiar hollow pull he'd learned to carry across months of smaller debts, but as something closer to a door swinging fully open at last after months of standing ajar. Everything that had been leaking slowly out of him, with each careful, measured raising suddenly gone all at once, all the way, deliberately spent rather than merely lost. He heard distantly the sound of the line reforming around Ren, the soldiers who'd nearly reached her scattering before a wall of the newly risen dead. He heard the column's remaining discipline finally, completely collapse. He didn't hear Rennick fall. He learned that afterward, from Ren, once enough of the world had come back into focus to receive the telling of it, that Harwick, weaponless himself by then, bones cracked and failing from hours of holding a line that should have broken twice over, had used the last of whatever discipline 40 years dead had left him to put himself between a staggered, weaponless Rennick and the chaos Emmerich's surge had unleashed, and that Rennick, disarmed and finally fully undone, had not survived what came after. Emmerich knelt in the dirt long after the fighting stopped entirely, hammer still buried to the head in earth gone dark with blood that wasn't only his, and understood, in the kind of quiet that follows any ending too large to take in all at once, that something in him had finally, permanently changed. He looked at his own hands. The blue-green lines no longer faded, not even slightly, not even after long minutes of stillness. Settled now, permanent, climbing past both elbows in patterns that would never again recede. When Ren reached him, kneeling in the ruined dirt beside him, her face carried the plain fear of someone checking whether the man in front of her was still in any way that mattered. The same man she'd fallen for across a forge fire and a stolen locket and a lie burned together in a smithy months ago. Emmerich. She took his face in both hands, made him look at her properly. Emmerich, look at me. He looked at her. He felt distantly that he should have felt more than he did, relief, grief, something, and found instead only a flat, wide calm sitting where all of that should have been, the stillness of a man who has finally, completely paid every part of a debt he'd been quietly accumulating for the better part of a year. "I'm here," he said, and meant it as truthfully as he could still manage to mean anything. She held him a long moment, without asking for more than that. The chapter house at Kale's Reach didn't survive what followed, not in any form its own leadership would have recognized as survival. Ren carried the truth back herself, evidence gathered across months of careful, patient work, records of purges dressed up as heresy trials, financial ledgers showing decades of extorted charitable placements exactly like the one that had held her own brother, testimony from villages Rennick had personally overseen the ruin of. She laid all of it before the regional lords whose support the church had always depended on, and watched that support withdraw within a single season once the truth became too documented, too public, too thoroughly proven to comfortably ignore any longer. The ashblades scattered, some fled, some quietly changed sides once the ground shifted beneath them. The chapter house itself stood empty within the year, its authority stripped by the very kingdoms that had once knelt to it. Though the ordinary faith of ordinary people, the flame itself, the simple belief that had never actually required an institution's cruelty to survive, carried on well enough without it, the way faith generally does once the men claiming to speak for it are finally properly removed from the speaking. Tobin came to Falomir 3 months after the battle, delivered safely by the baker Ren had trusted with exactly this contingency, 12 years old and thin from cloister rations, and entirely unprepared for how tightly his sister held on to him the moment he stepped down from the cart. Emmerich watched that reunion from the smithy doorway and felt something move behind the flatness that had settled into him since the choke point. Not the full warmth he suspected he once would have felt, that particular capacity gone now and likely gone for good, but something smaller and quieter that told him the flatness hadn't taken absolutely everything after all. Harwick's bones lay buried again at Thornwick Field, this time with a proper marker Emmerich had forged himself. Plain iron, no false glory carved into it, just a name and the 2 words Emmerich had insisted on. He held. The 40 mercenaries from Kelmore Vale returned to their own unmarked hill and were allowed, at Emmerich's own quiet decision, to finally fully rest. He kept one grave active. Only one. The broken sword marker stood now at the edge of Fallomere's churchyard, planted properly, no longer carried from campsite to campsite in his own pack. Emmerich visited it most evenings, hammer in hand out of habit more than any remaining need, and sat with the empty grave the same way he'd once sat with the living skeleton that used to answer him from beside it. "We won," he told it, one evening roughly a year after the choke point, Wren's voice audible behind him in the smithy, Tobin's laughter carrying faint across the yard where the boy had taken, unexpectedly, to helping with the bellows. "You'd have liked to see it. I think you'd have organized the aftermath better than I did, too." The grave, as always, gave him nothing back. He hadn't expected it to. Some things a man keeps having conversations with anyway, long after there's anyone left to answer. He spun the hammer once through his fingers, slow, the old habit outliving every single thing it had ever originally been for, and turned back toward the smithy light and the sound of a boy's laughter and a woman waiting for him to come finish whatever the evening's ordinary work still required. Some debts get paid in full. Some debts you simply learn eventually to carry forward instead. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just folded into the shape of whatever life gets built on the far side of paying them. Emmerich walked home to that life, hammer at his belt, and didn't look back at the grave again until morning.